The morning my oldest son called me a financial parasite, I calmly walked to my home office and made a single phone call that would strip away $47,000 in monthly payments from my 4 children's lives forever. What they didn't know as they calculated my worth in dollars and cents was that for the past 15 years, I had been quietly paying their mortgages, car loans, private school tuitions, and credit card bills through a trust fund they never knew existed. By sunset that same day, their safety net would be gone, and they would finally learn what it truly meant to stand on their own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Walsh, and I'm 74 years old. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything for your children's happiness and success. I thought love was measured by how much you gave, how many problems you solved, and how seamlessly you could remove obstacles from their paths. I was wrong about many things, but I was most wrong about this. I believed that unconditional giving would naturally inspire unconditional gratitude and respect. I live in Millbrook, a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, in the same modest 2-story colonial home where my late husband Thomas and I raised our 4 children. The house sits on Maple Street, lined with mature oak trees that turn brilliant gold every autumn. It's nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small kitchen with outdated appliances, and a living room where the furniture has remained unchanged for 20 years. The beige carpet shows wear patterns from decades of family life, and the wallpaper in the dining room has faded to a soft yellow that some might call dated. But this house has always been filled with love, laughter, and the countless memories of a family that once seemed unbreakably close. Thomas passed away 3 years ago after a brief but fierce battle with lung cancer. He was 68, a man who had worked as a mechanical engineer for 37 years at the same company, never missing a day unless one of our children was sick or needed him at a school event. He was methodical, brilliant with numbers, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to see patterns and opportunities that others missed. While our neighbors knew him as the quiet man who kept his lawn perfectly manicured and always had his Christmas lights up before Thanksgiving, they had no idea that Thomas Walsh was also a financial genius who had turned our modest middle-class income into something extraordinary. Our 4 children are now adults with families of their own. James, our oldest at 46, works as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. He lives in an upscale neighborhood called Riverside Heights with his wife Sandra and their 3 teenage children. The house is a sprawling contemporary, with a 3-car garage, a swimming pool, and a view of the Willamette River that adds at least $200,000 to its value. James drives a BMW X7, Sandra drives a Mercedes GLE, and each of their children has their own car, all late-model vehicles that gleam in their circular driveway. Our daughter, Jennifer, 43, is a marketing director for a tech startup downtown. She and her husband Mark live in a converted warehouse loft that they've transformed into something you'd see in architectural magazines. Exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, custom furniture that costs more than most people's annual salaries. Jennifer wears designer clothes, carries handbags that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and travels to Europe twice a year for what she calls inspiration trips. Her 2 children attend Westbrook Academy, a private school where tuition runs $35,000 per year, per child. David, our second son at 40, owns a boutique fitness studio in the trendy Pearl District. His business, Elite Performance. Training caters to Portland's wealthy professionals who pay premium prices for personalized workout regimens. David lives in a penthouse condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. He drives a Tesla Model S, wears clothes from brands I can't pronounce, and vacations in places like Aspen and the Hamptons. He's never married but has been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Clarissa, who works as a yoga instructor at high-end retreats. Our youngest, Michelle, is 37 and works as an interior designer for luxury homes. She and her husband Robert live in a custom-built house in the hills west of Portland, complete with a wine cellar, a home theater, and landscaping that requires a team of professionals to maintain. Michelle drives a Range Rover, Robert drives a Porsche Cayenne, and their twin boys, now 8 years old, are already enrolled in elite soccer and tennis programs that cost hundreds of dollars per month. To anyone looking from the outside, Thomas and I had raised 4 remarkably successful children. They lived in beautiful homes, drove expensive cars, sent their children to the best schools, and seemed to have achieved the American dream in spectacular fashion. Family gatherings were always held at their homes rather than ours, partly because they had more space, but mostly because our modest house on Maple Street seemed shabby in comparison to their palatial dwellings. What none of them knew, what I had kept secret even from my closest friends, was that their success was built on a foundation they had never seen. For 15 years, since Thomas's carefully planned investments had begun yielding substantial returns, I had been quietly funding their lifestyles through a trust fund that generated enough income to support all 4 of their families without them ever realizing it. The trust, officially called the Walsh Family Security Trust, was Thomas's masterpiece. He had started it when our children were in their 20s, struggling to establish themselves in their careers. "Catherine," he had told me one evening as we sat in our small living room, reviewing investment statements, "I don't want our children to know about this money until they're truly established. I want them to develop their own work ethic, their own sense of accomplishment. But I also don't want them to struggle the way we did in our early years." The trust was structured so that it would pay various bills directly: mortgage companies, car dealerships, credit card companies, private schools. The money never went into our children's accounts, so they never saw it as income. Instead, they simply lived in a world where their financial obligations were mysteriously manageable, despite their spending habits. When James got approved for a mortgage on a house that should have been beyond his means, he attributed it to his excellent credit and negotiation skills. When Jennifer's credit card bills disappeared each month, she assumed her husband was paying them from his business account. When David's luxury condo fees and car payments never seemed to create financial strain, he credited his business acumen and smart budgeting. The trust had grown to $8.3 million by the time Thomas passed away, generating approximately $47,000 in monthly distributions that were divided among our children's expenses. James received $14,000 monthly toward his mortgage, car payments, and his children's private school tuition. Jennifer received $12,000 monthly for her credit card bills, mortgage, and car payments. David received $10,000 monthly for his condo fees, car payment, and business expenses. Michelle received $11,000 monthly for her mortgage, car payments, and the boys' activities. They lived like wealthy people because, technically, they were wealthy. They just didn't know the source of their wealth was sitting in a rocking chair, in a modest house on Maple Street, quietly managing the financial puppet strings that made their lives possible. For years, I told myself this arrangement was perfect. My children were thriving, their kids were getting excellent educations, and everyone was happy. I never asked for recognition or gratitude because I never told them what I was doing. I simply watched from the sidelines as they built what they believed were self-made success stories, and I took pride in knowing that I was the invisible force making it all possible. But pride, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. Pride can make you ignore warning signs. Pride can make you believe that love given in secret will somehow be appreciated and returned in equal measure. Pride can blind you to the fact that people who don't know they're being helped might develop a sense of entitlement rather than gratitude. The first crack in my illusion came 2 years after Thomas's death, during what was supposed to be a celebration of James's promotion to regional sales manager. The whole family had gathered at Jennifer's loft for dinner, and the conversation naturally turned to career achievements and financial success. As I sat quietly in the corner, listening to my children discuss their accomplishments, I began to notice something that made my stomach turn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They weren't just proud of their success. They were dismissive of anyone who hadn't achieved similar levels of prosperity. James made cutting remarks about his co-workers who still lived in starter homes. Jennifer rolled her eyes when discussing friends who shopped at chain stores instead of boutiques. David openly mocked people who drove cars more than 3 years old. Michelle complained about having to socialize with other parents at school events who clearly didn't understand quality. More troubling was how they spoke about Thomas and me. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of benevolent condescension that suggested they saw us as people who had never quite figured out how to achieve real success. Mom and Dad did their best, James said at one point, but they never really understood how to build wealth. They were too conservative, too afraid to take risks. It's sweet how they're still in that little house, Jennifer added. I've offered to help Mom redecorate, maybe update some things, but she seems content with her simple lifestyle. Simple lifestyle. The phrase echoed in my mind as I sat in their designer furniture, surrounded by artwork that cost more than my annual property taxes, listening to my children dismiss the choices that had actually made their current lives possible. But the real wake-up call came 6 months later, during a family emergency that would change everything. I had slipped on ice in my driveway during a winter storm and broken my wrist. It was a minor injury. But at 74, even minor injuries require careful attention. I called James first, since he lived closest to me, and asked if he could drive me to the emergency room. Mom, this really isn't a good time, he said, his voice carrying the distracted tone of someone checking emails while talking. I'm in the middle of a huge presentation for work. Can't you call an Uber or something? An Uber to the emergency room. At 74 years old with a potentially broken bone. I called Jennifer next. Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry, but Mark and I are at a wine tasting event with some really important clients. This could be huge for my career. Maybe try David. David was at a fitness convention in Seattle. Michelle was at a design conference in San Francisco. I ended up calling my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a widow my age who dropped everything to drive me to the hospital and sat with me for 4 hours while I waited to be seen, got x-rays, and had my wrist set in a cast. She never once made me feel like an inconvenience. She never once checked her phone or mentioned other things she could be doing. She simply stayed with me because that's what people do for each other when they care. The next day, all 4 of my children called to check on me. Their concern seemed genuine, but each conversation followed the same pattern. They were sorry they couldn't be there, but work obligations had made it impossible. They hoped I understood. They were sure I was. Fine, because I was so independent and capable. Independent and capable. Translation. We don't need to worry about you because you've never needed us before. Over the following months, I began to see our family dynamic with new clarity. My children loved me, but they loved me the way people love a reliable appliance, grateful for its consistent performance, but not particularly concerned about its maintenance until it breaks down completely. They called regularly, but the conversations were perfunctory. They visited for holidays, but always with the air of people fulfilling an obligation rather than seeking genuine connection. And gradually, I began to understand something that should have been obvious years earlier. By solving all their problems invisibly, I had taught my children that they didn't need to solve problems at all. By removing all obstacles from their paths, I had prevented them from developing the resilience and empathy that come from facing real challenges. By giving them everything while asking for nothing, I had inadvertently created 4 adults who took abundance for granted and had no concept of sacrifice. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in March, 3 months after my fall. I had been feeling increasingly isolated and decided to be more proactive about staying connected with my children. I called James and asked if I could come over for dinner that weekend. Nothing fancy, just a chance to spend time together. "This weekend?" he said, and I could hear him typing on his computer. "Mom, Sandra and I are really busy. The kids have tournaments, I have a golf thing on Saturday, and we're having dinner with the Hendersons on Sunday. Maybe next month?" Next month. Like I was a dental appointment to be rescheduled. I called Jennifer with the same request. "Oh, Mom, that's so sweet, but we're completely booked. Mark's parents are visiting and we have 3 dinner parties lined up. You know how it is with our social calendar." I didn't know how it was with their social calendar because I was never part of it. David was traveling for business. Michelle was hosting a dinner party for potential clients and couldn't possibly add another person to the carefully planned guest list. As I hung up the phone after the 4th rejection, I sat in my quiet living room and realized that despite having 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 3 children-in-law, I was essentially alone. I had spent 15 years ensuring their happiness and comfort, and in return, I had become someone they tolerated rather than treasured. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the leather-bound journal where Thomas and Dee. I used to write letters to each other, a tradition we had started early in our marriage and continued until his death. I found the last letter he had written to me, dated just 2 weeks before he passed away. "My dearest Catherine," it read in his careful handwriting, "I hope you'll remember that love should flow both ways. We've given our children everything, but we must also teach them to give. If they never learn to sacrifice for others, they'll never understand the true joy of love. Don't let them take your generosity for granted forever. You deserve to be cherished, not just tolerated." As I read those words, I felt something shift inside me. Thomas had seen what I was too blind to recognize. Our children had learned to receive love, but not to give it. They had learned to take for granted the sacrifices made on their behalf because they had never been asked to make sacrifices themselves. The next morning, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I picked up the phone and called Harrison and Associates, the law firm that managed the Walsh Family Security Trust. "Mr. Harrison," I said when he came on the line, "I need to make some changes to the trust distribution schedule." "Of course, Mrs. Walsh. What kind of changes are you considering?" "I want to cancel all payments to my children, effective immediately." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Walsh, are you certain? This would mean—" "I know exactly what it would mean," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. "They're about to learn what it's like to live without a safety net they never knew they had." Within hours, the monthly distributions that had been quietly supporting my children's lifestyles for 15 years came to an abrupt end. By the end of the month, they would begin receiving bills they had never seen before, payment notices for obligations they thought were being handled by someone else, and the crushing realization that their comfortable lives had been built on a foundation that was no longer there. As I hung up the phone with Mr. Harrison, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of my own power. For too long, I had been the invisible benefactor, the silent supporter, the forgotten source of their security. Now, they were about to discover just how much they had depended on someone they had learned to take for granted. The real education was about to begin. The first sign that my children's world was about to collapse came exactly 18 days after. I canceled the trust fund payments. I was watering my garden when James's BMW pulled into my driveway with unusual urgency, the tires squealing slightly as he braked. Through my kitchen window, I watched him sit in his car for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his face wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager who had crashed his first car. When he finally knocked on my door, his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something I barely recognized, vulnerability mixed with confusion. James had always been the golden child, the one who seemed to glide through life without effort, landing promotions and opportunities with what appeared to be natural ease. But the man standing on my doorstep looked genuinely shaken. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice lacking its typical authority. "Something weird is happening with our finances and I can't figure it out." I invited him in and made coffee, watching as he sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with homework 25 years earlier. His expensive suit looked wrinkled, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "It's the strangest thing," he began, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be banking apps. "For the past couple of weeks, we've been getting these bills that I've never seen before. The mortgage company sent a notice, saying our payment is overdue, but that's impossible because it's always been automatically handled. Then yesterday, Sandra got a call from American Express saying our account is past due by almost $8,000. He looked up at me with genuine bewilderment. "Mom, I've never missed a payment in my life. My credit score is perfect. But suddenly, it's like our entire financial system has just stopped working." I maintained a neutral expression while internally marveling at how completely oblivious he had been to the source of his financial stability. "Have you checked with your bank?" I asked. "Maybe there's an issue with your automatic payments." "That's just it," James said, his frustration evident. "There were no automatic payments set up for these things. According to the bank, these bills have never been paid from our accounts. But they've obviously been paid somehow, because we've never gotten notices before. Sandra thinks maybe the companies made some kind of mistake, but 3 different companies making the same mistake at the same time?" He paused, studying my face as if looking for answers I might possess. "The weird part is, when I called the mortgage company to straighten this out, they said the payments had been coming from something called the Walsh Family Security Trust. But I've never heard of any Walsh Family Security Trust. Do you know anything about that?" This was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating. The moment when my children would begin to understand that their success had not been entirely self-made. I could have told him everything then, could have explained the 15 years of invisible support that had made his lifestyle possible. Instead, I chose to let the lesson unfold naturally. "I'm not familiar with any trust like that," I said carefully. "Maybe it was something your father set up that you've forgotten about?" James shook his head vigorously. "Dad never mentioned anything like that to me. And besides, if there was some kind of family trust paying our bills, wouldn't we know about it? Wouldn't there be paperwork or tax implications or something?" The irony was almost painful. Thomas had indeed structured the trust to minimize tax implications for our children, ensuring that the payments were handled in a way that wouldn't create additional complications for them. We had been so careful to make their lives easier that we had made them completely unaware of how their lives actually worked. "Maybe you should contact an attorney," I suggested. "Someone who specializes in estate planning might be able to help you track down where these payments were coming from." James nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "The thing is, Mom, if these payments stop permanently, we're looking at serious problems. Our mortgage payment alone is $4,500 a month. The credit card minimums are another $2,000. Sandra's car payment, the kids' school tuition." He trailed off, apparently doing calculations in his head. "Can't you cover those expenses with your salary?" I asked, knowing full well that despite his impressive title and comfortable lifestyle, James had never actually budgeted for the true cost of his family's expenses. "Well, yeah, technically," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that our whole budget was based on not having those payments. We'd have to cut back on a lot of things. Cancel the country club membership, maybe sell Sandra's Mercedes, take the kids out of Riverside Prep." He looked genuinely distressed at these possibilities. As I listened to my eldest son contemplate the terrible prospect of living within his actual means, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to reveal the truth and restore his financial security immediately. But a larger part of me realized that this confusion and concern was perhaps the first real adversity James had faced in decades, and maybe it was exactly what he needed. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said gently. "You're intelligent and resourceful. You've built a successful career. If these mystery payments have stopped, I'm confident you can adjust your budget accordingly." James looked at me with an expression that suggested he had never actually considered having to truly manage his family's finances. It's not that simple, Mom. We've got commitments, lifestyle obligations, people we socialize with. You can't just suddenly start driving a Honda instead of a BMW. What would people think? What would people think? There it was, the underlying concern that had driven so many of his family's choices. Not what would make them happy or what they could actually afford, but what would maintain their image among people whose opinions apparently mattered more than their own financial stability. James, I said, leaning forward slightly. Do you remember when you were 25 and you got your first apartment? You were so proud of that little one-bedroom place, even though the kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people. You invited your father and me over for dinner, and you cooked spaghetti on a hot plate because you didn't have a real stove yet. He smiled at the memory. That place was terrible. The neighbors were loud, the plumbing didn't work half the time, and I had to park 6 blocks away because there was no designated parking. But you were happy, I continued. You felt like you had accomplished something real. You were proud of paying your own rent, buying your own groceries, managing your own life. James was quiet for a moment, perhaps recognizing where I was going with this. That was different, Mom. I was just starting out then. I didn't have a family to support, responsibilities to maintain. What if this situation is an opportunity rather than a crisis? I suggested. What if it's a chance to reconnect with that feeling of genuine accomplishment, of knowing that everything you have is something you've truly earned? But James wasn't ready to hear that message. Instead, he spent the next hour describing various theories about what might have happened to disrupt their mysterious financial support system. Maybe it was a computer glitch at the bank. Maybe some kind of identity theft situation. Maybe a clerical error at the trust company. He seemed determined to find an explanation that would restore the status quo, rather than accept the possibility that this might be a permanent change. As he prepared to leave, James turned to me with a request that revealed just how little he understood about managing real financial pressure. Mom, I hate to ask this, but would it be possible for you to help us out temporarily while we figure out what's going on? Maybe just cover the mortgage for a month or 2 until we can get this sorted out? I looked at my son. This successful, confident man who drove a $70,000 car and lived in a house worth $800,000, asking his elderly mother for financial assistance. The absurdity was breathtaking. James, I said gently, I'm living on your father's pension and Social Security. I don't have $4,500 a month to spare. His face fell slightly, as if this possibility had never occurred to him. In his mind, apparently, everyone had access to mystery funding sources that could solve financial problems without effort or sacrifice. 2 days after James's visit, Jennifer called me in a state of barely controlled panic. Unlike her older brothers, confused frustration, Jennifer's voice carried a note of genuine fear that made my heart ache despite my resolve to let this lesson play out. Mom, something terrible is happening, she said without preamble. Mark and I are facing some kind of financial crisis, and we can't figure out what's going on. Jennifer explained that she and Mark had received a flurry of overdue notices for bills they claimed had never been their responsibility. Credit card companies demanding payment for balances they insisted had always been handled automatically. The management company for their loft demanding 3 months of association fees that they claimed had never been billed to them before. The worst part, Jennifer continued, her voice shaking slightly, is that our credit scores have dropped almost 200 points in the past 2 weeks. 200 points, Mom. Do you know what that means for our business? Mark's company is trying to secure a major loan for expansion, and now this credit thing is threatening the entire deal. Unlike James, who seemed primarily concerned about maintaining appearances, Jennifer was beginning to grasp the real-world consequences of sudden financial instability. Her marketing background had given her a better understanding of how financial problems could cascade into professional and personal disasters. We went to our accountant, she continued, and he's as confused as we are. According to his records, these payments were being made by something called the Walsh Family Security Trust, but when we tried to contact them, the law firm handling it said the trust had suspended all distributions indefinitely. There was a long pause before Jennifer asked the question I knew was coming. Mom, did Dad ever mention setting up a trust for the family? Because if he did, and if something's gone wrong with it, we need to fix this immediately. Our entire financial structure is apparently built on this thing we've never heard of. The pain in her voice was real, and for a moment, I wavered in my resolve. Jennifer had always been the most emotionally open of my children, the one who seemed to maintain the strongest connection to family. But she was also the one who had been most dismissive of Thomas's and my lifestyle choices, most vocal about our failure to build significant wealth. I don't know anything about a trust like that, I told her, maintaining the same careful neutrality I had used with James. Maybe you should speak with an estate attorney. We already have, Jennifer said. 3 of them, actually. They all say the same thing, that if there was a family trust making these payments, there would have been legal documentation that we should have received years ago. But we've never seen anything like that. She was quiet for a moment before continuing. Mom, I need to ask you something, and please don't take this the wrong way. Is there any possibility that you and Dad had more money than you let on? Because the only way this situation makes sense is if there was some source of family wealth that we weren't aware of. This was closer to the truth than any of my children had come so far, and I felt my heart rate increase slightly. Jennifer, you knew your father's salary. You knew I was a teacher. Where would we have gotten the kind of money needed to pay everyone's bills? I don't know, she admitted. But something was paying our bills and now it's not, and we're looking at losing everything we've built. Our loft, our cars, the kids' school, our entire lifestyle. If there's something you know that could help us understand what's happening, please tell me. The desperation in her voice was genuine, and I found myself struggling with the decision to maintain my silence. These were my children, people I loved more than my own life, and they were suffering. The maternal instinct to solve their problems, to restore their comfort and security, was almost overwhelming. But then I remembered the broken wrist, the 4 phone calls asking for help, the casual dismissal of my invitation to dinner. I remembered years of being treated like a reliable but unremarkable fixture in their lives, appreciated but not treasured, tolerated but not cherished. I wish I could help you understand what's happening, I told Jennifer. But sometimes life presents us with challenges that force us to grow in ways we never expected. Maybe this is an opportunity for you and Mark to build something that's entirely your own. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my quiet living room and wondered if I was doing the right thing. My children were struggling, confused and frightened. They were facing the prospect of losing homes and lifestyles they had taken for granted. Their children might have to change schools. Their social circles might shift. Their entire sense of identity was being challenged. But for the first time in years, they had called me because they needed something I might be able to provide, not babysitting or a casserole for a dinner party, but real help with a real problem. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a convenient resource, but a potentially crucial ally. The question was whether they would learn to value that alliance, or whether they would simply see me as another problem to be solved in their quest to restore their comfortable ignorance. 3 days later, I got my answer when David showed up at my door at 7 in the morning. His usual polished appearance replaced by the look of a man who hadn't slept in days. David stood in my doorway at 7 in the morning, and for the first time in his adult life, my fitness-obsessed son looked broken. His usually immaculate appearance had been replaced by wrinkled clothes, unshaven stubble, and bloodshot eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The confident entrepreneur who had built elite performance training into Portland's premier boutique fitness studio was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was barely holding himself together. "Mom, I need to come in," he said, his voice hoarse. "Everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do." I led him to the kitchen, noticing how his hands shook slightly as he accepted the coffee I offered. David had always been the most physically disciplined of my children, maintaining a strict workout regimen and diet that kept him looking a decade younger than his 40 years. But stress had aged him overnight, etching lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. "The business is finished," he said without preamble, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers. "Completely finished. I got served with eviction papers yesterday for 3 months of unpaid rent on the studio. 3 months, Mom. I had no idea we were behind on rent." David explained that elite performance training operated on razor-thin profit margins, like most small businesses in Portland's competitive fitness market. What had made it sustainable was that his personal expenses, his penthouse condo, his Tesla payment, his high-end wardrobe and lifestyle costs, had apparently been covered by mysterious payments he had never tracked or questioned. "I always assumed Clarissa was handling the personal bills," he said, referring to his long-term girlfriend. "She's got a head for numbers, and since we've been together for 5 years, it seemed natural that she would manage our household finances. But when I asked her about it yesterday, she looked at me like I was insane." He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages between him and Clarissa. Her responses grew increasingly concerned and then angry as she realized David had been living under the assumption that someone else was paying for his expensive lifestyle. "She's furious with me," David continued, his voice cracking slightly. "She thinks I've been lying to her about our financial situation this whole time. She moved out yesterday, took all her stuff, and said she can't be with someone who's either delusional or dishonest about something as basic as who pays the bills." The loss of Clarissa seemed to devastate David almost as much as the financial crisis. Unlike his siblings, who had built their identities around material success, David had always seemed to derive his self-worth from physical achievement and personal relationships. Losing both his business and his partner in the same week had shattered his sense of who he was. "But that's not even the worst part," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I called the property management company to try to work out a payment plan, and they told me the most insane thing. They said my rent had been paid by something called the Walsh Family Security Trust for the past 8 years. 8 years, Mom. I've been living in that condo for 8 years thinking I was paying my own way, but apparently I never paid a single month's rent." David looked up at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. "They showed me the payment records. Same trust that James and Jennifer mentioned when they called me yesterday. But here's what I don't understand. If Dad had set up some kind of trust to pay our bills, wouldn't we know about it? Wouldn't there be legal documents or tax implications or something?" I maintained my neutral expression while internally marveling at how completely my children had abdicated responsibility for understanding their own financial lives. They had been content to live in a world where bills mysteriously paid themselves, where their lifestyles remained sustainable, despite spending patterns that should have bankrupted them years ago. "Maybe your father wanted it to be a surprise," I suggested carefully. "You know how he was about planning ahead, thinking about the family's future." David shook his head vigorously. "But this doesn't make sense as a surprise, Mom. If Dad had millions of dollars to set up a trust, where did that money come from? He was an engineer at a mid-level company. You were a teacher. Even with good savings habits, how could you have accumulated enough wealth to pay everyone's bills for years?" This was the closest any of my children had come to asking the right questions. David's business background had given him a better understanding of cash flow and financial sustainability than his siblings possessed. He was beginning to grasp that the level of support they had been receiving required substantial wealth that seemed inconsistent with his parents' apparent financial status. "Your father was very good with investments," I said, which was true enough. "He spent years studying the markets, making careful choices. Some people are better at building wealth than others realize." But even good investments wouldn't explain this level of ongoing support, David pressed. According to the property management company, my rent payments alone have totaled over $400,000 in 8 years. And that's just one expense for one person. If the same thing was happening for James and Jennifer and Michelle, he trailed off, apparently doing calculations in his head. When he looked back up at me, his expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching suspicion. Mom, we're talking about millions of dollars, multiple millions. Even if Dad was some kind of investment genius, where would that initial capital have come from? And why would you and Dad choose to live so modestly if you had access to that kind of wealth? I felt a moment of genuine pride in David's analytical thinking, even as it threatened to unravel the careful fiction I was maintaining. Of all my children, he was the first to recognize that the level of support they had been receiving indicated massive family wealth that seemed inconsistent with Thomas's and my lifestyle choices. Maybe your father wanted to teach you all the value of hard work, I suggested. Maybe he thought that if you knew about family money, you wouldn't develop your own initiative and drive. David considered this for a moment, then shook his head. That would make sense if we had known about the trust and chosen to work anyway. But we didn't know. We thought we were paying our own way, building our own success. If Dad wanted to teach us about hard work, wouldn't it have been more effective to let us actually experience the consequences of our financial choices? The logic was unassailable, and I found myself genuinely impressed by David's reasoning. He was asking exactly the right questions, approaching the mystery from angles that his siblings had missed entirely. I don't know what your father was thinking, I said honestly. He didn't always explain his reasoning to me. But David wasn't satisfied with vague answers. He had lost his business, his relationship, and his sense of identity in the space of a week, and he was determined to understand why. Mom, I need you to be straight with me about something, he said, leaning forward with an intensity I hadn't seen from him since he was a teenager arguing for extended curfew. Do you know more about this trust situation than you've been telling us? The directness of the question caught me off guard. James had been too confused to ask pointed questions. Jennifer had been too panicked to think clearly. But David, stripped of his comfortable illusions and facing the collapse of everything he thought he had built, was approaching the situation with the focused determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Why would you think that? I asked, buying time while I decided how much truth to reveal. Because your reactions don't make sense, David said, his voice gaining strength as he articulated his suspicions. James calls you confused about mystery payments. Jennifer calls you panicked about financial collapse. And I show up devastated about losing everything. And you're just calm. You're asking logical questions, offering reasonable suggestions, but you don't seem surprised by any of this. He paused, studying my face carefully. Most people, if their children suddenly started facing financial crises, involving mysterious family trusts, would be shocked, confused, trying to figure out what was happening. But you're acting like this is a problem that needs to be managed, not a mystery that needs to be solved. David's perception was uncomfortably accurate. I had indeed been managing the situation rather than reacting to it, maintaining careful, emotional distance while my children struggled with confusion and fear. My responses had been too measured, too strategic, for someone who was supposedly learning about these problems for the first time. I'm trying to be supportive, I said, but even to my own ears the explanation sounded weak. Mom, David said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet determination. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me a direct answer. Did you and Dad have significantly more money than you've let on? Are you the source of the Walsh Family Security Trust? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than I had expected. David's analytical mind and desperate circumstances had cut through the careful misdirection I had been offering his siblings. He had asked the one question I couldn't answer without either lying outright or revealing the truth I wasn't ready to share. David, I said carefully, I think you're giving your father and me too much credit. We were middle-class people who lived within our means. That's not an answer, he said firmly. That's a deflection. I asked you a specific question. Are you the source of the trust that's been paying our bills? The silence stretched between us, and I could see David interpreting my hesitation as confirmation of his suspicions. His expression shifted from desperate confusion to something approaching anger. You are, aren't you? He said, his voice rising slightly. You and Dad have been secretly paying our bills for years, and now you've stopped. But why? What changed? What did we do that made you decide to pull the plug on our entire lives? I felt the careful structure I had built around this situation beginning to crumble. David had not only identified the truth, but was demanding an explanation for my actions. The conversation was moving faster than I had intended, toward revelations I wasn't prepared to make. I think you're making assumptions, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Mom, stop, David said, standing up from the table with sudden energy. Just stop. I've lost my business, my girlfriend, and my home in the past week. I'm facing bankruptcy and complete financial ruin. If you know why this is happening, if you have the power to fix it, I need you to tell me right now. The desperation in his voice was real, and I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort him, to solve his problems, to restore his security. But I also remembered the years of casual dismissal, the assumption that I would always be available, to help without reciprocal concern for my own well-being. What if this situation is teaching you something important? I asked quietly. What if struggling with real financial consequences helps you build character that you've never had to develop? David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see understanding dawning in his eyes. Not just understanding of the financial situation, but understanding of my motivations, my frustrations, my decision to let him face real adversity for the first time in his adult life. You're doing this on purpose, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're letting us suffer because you think we need to learn some kind of lesson. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I realized that the careful revelations I had planned were happening much more quickly and directly than I had anticipated. David had cut through weeks of gradual understanding and arrived at the heart of the matter in a single conversation. I think, I said slowly, that people don't appreciate what they've never had to earn. David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, recognition, hurt, and finally, a kind of resigned. Understanding that suggested he was beginning to grasp not just what had happened, but why it had been necessary. How long? He asked quietly. How long have you been supporting all of us? 15 years, I said, the truth finally emerging. Since the trust was established. The number seemed to hit David like a physical blow. 15 years of secret support. 15 years of living a life he had never actually funded. 15 years of success built on a foundation he had never acknowledged or appreciated. And you stopped because none of you called when I broke my wrist, because you were all too busy to have dinner with me, because I realized that I had raised 4 children who knew how to receive love but had never learned how to give it. As David absorbed this information, I could see him beginning to understand not just the mechanics of what had happened, but the emotional journey that had led to this moment. The mother he had taken for granted was revealing herself to be far more complex, powerful, and intentional than he had ever imagined. David's revelation to his siblings that our mother had been their secret benefactor for 15 years triggered what could only be described as a family emergency session. Within hours of leaving my house, he had contacted James, Jennifer, and Michelle, sharing his discoveries and demanding an immediate family meeting. By 6 o'clock that evening, all 4 of my children sat in James's living room, their spouses deliberately excluded, trying to process the magnitude of what they had learned. I knew about this gathering because Jennifer called me at 5:30, her voice carrying a mixture of hurt, confusion, and barely controlled anger that I had never heard from her before. "Mom, we need you at James's house tonight," she said without any preliminary pleasantries. "David told us what you admitted to him this morning, and we need to discuss this situation as a family. All of us, together, right now." There was no question in her tone, no polite request for my availability. For the first time in years, my children were making demands rather than requests, treating me as someone who owed them explanations rather than someone whose time and energy were optional. Conveniences. "I'm not sure what David told you," I began, but Jennifer cut me off immediately. "Mom, don't. Just don't. We know you've been paying our bills for 15 years through some secret trust fund, and we know you stopped doing it without telling us. What we don't know is why you would do something so devastating to your own children without even giving us a chance to understand what was happening." The pain in her voice was genuine, and I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort and explain. But I also recognized that this conversation, the one I had been both dreading and anticipating, was finally going to happen on their terms rather than mine. "I'll be there," I said simply. The drive to James's house gave me 20 minutes to prepare for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. My children had spent the afternoon comparing notes, sharing details about their individual financial crises, and calculating the true scope of the support they had been receiving. They had moved beyond confusion and panic into a state of focused determination to understand not just what had happened, but why their mother had chosen to upend their lives so completely. When I arrived at James's house, I found my 4 children, arranged in his living room with the kind of formal precision usually reserved for business meetings or intervention sessions. They had clearly prepared for this confrontation, and their unified front represented a level of sibling cooperation I hadn't seen since they were teenagers. James, as the eldest, assumed the role of family spokesperson. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something more serious and measured, suggesting that the afternoon's discussions had forced him to confront aspects of his life he had never examined before. "Mom, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair they had positioned facing the sofa where all 4 of them sat in a row. The arrangement felt deliberately confrontational, designed to emphasize that this was 4 against 1, rather than a family discussion among equals. "We've spent the afternoon putting together the pieces of what David discovered this morning," James continued, his voice taking on the formal tone he probably used in important business presentations. "Based on our individual financial crises, and the information David got from you, we've calculated that the Walsh Family Security Trust has been providing approximately $47,000 per month in support to our 4 families." He paused to let this number sink in, then continued. "Over 15 years, that represents total support of more than $8 million. $8 million, Mom. Money that apparently came from you and Dad. Money that we never knew existed. Money that was supporting lifestyles we thought we had built through our own efforts." Jennifer picked up the thread of the conversation, her marketing background evident in how she presented the emotional impact of these revelations. "Do you understand what this means for us psychologically? We've spent 15 years believing we were successful, independent adults who had built comfortable lives through hard work and smart choices. Now we're discovering that everything we thought we had accomplished was actually funded by our parents' secret charity." Michelle, who had been silent during her siblings' presentations, finally spoke with a voice that trembled slightly. "Mom, my children are in private school, enrolled in expensive activities, living in a house that costs more than Robert makes in 2 years. We've been planning their futures, making commitments, building a life that was apparently never sustainable. Without your help, now they're going to have to change schools, give up activities, move to a smaller house, and we have to explain to 8-year-old twins why their entire world is falling apart." The anguish in Michelle's voice was heartbreaking, and I found myself struggling to maintain the resolve that had seemed so clear when I was sitting alone in my quiet house. These were my children, people I loved more than my own life, and they were suffering because of choices I had made. But David, who had already processed some of these emotions during our morning conversation, brought the discussion back to the central question that needed to be addressed. Mom, we understand that you had the financial means to support us, and we're grateful for 15 years of help we didn't even know we were receiving. What we need to understand is why you stopped. What happened that made you decide to cut off? Support without warning, without discussion, without giving us any chance to prepare for the consequences? This was the moment I had been preparing for since I made that phone call to Mr. Harrison 6 weeks ago. The moment when I would have to explain not just what I had done, but why it had been necessary. The moment when I would have to help my children understand that their mother was more than just a source of unconditional support and forgiveness. It started with my broken wrist, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of what I was about to share. When I fell on the ice and needed help getting to the emergency room, I called each of you. Every single one of you was too busy to help your injured mother. James had a presentation. Jennifer had a wine tasting. David was at a conference. Michelle was traveling for work. I paused, watching their faces as they began to remember that day and recognize how their responses might have looked from my perspective. I ended up calling Mrs. Patterson, my 76-year-old neighbor, who dropped everything to drive me to the hospital and sit with me for 4 hours while I waited for treatment. She never once made me feel like an inconvenience. She never once checked her phone or mentioned other things she could be doing. She simply stayed with me because that's what people do for each other when they care. Jennifer started to speak, but I held up my hand to continue. That incident made me start paying attention to the pattern of our relationships. I realized that for years, our interactions had been entirely one-directional. You called when you needed babysitting, when you wanted advice, when you had problems that required solutions. But when I suggested dinner together, when I needed help with something, when I simply wanted to spend time with my children, everyone was always too busy. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mom, that's not fair. We've always been there for you when you really needed us. Have you? I asked quietly. When have you been there for me, James? When have any of you made sacrifices for my well-being? The way I've been making sacrifices for yours? The silence that followed was profound. My children looked at each other, apparently searching their memories for examples of times when they had prioritized their mother's needs over their own convenience, and finding very few. But that still doesn't explain why you didn't talk to us about this, Michelle said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. If you were feeling neglected or unappreciated, couldn't you have told us? Couldn't we have worked together to fix the problems in our relationships without destroying our financial stability? This question got to the heart of why I had chosen such a dramatic approach rather than attempting gradual communication and relationship repair. Michelle, for 15 years, I had been solving your problems invisibly. Your mortgage payments, your car loans, your children's school tuition, your credit card bills, all handled quietly in the background so you never had to worry about them. I had become the invisible foundation of your lives, and when I tried to become more visible, to ask for more attention and consideration, I was told that everyone was too busy. I leaned forward slightly, making sure I had everyone's attention. How could I explain to you that your comfortable lifestyles were built on my support when you didn't even know that support existed? How could I ask you to appreciate sacrifices you had never been aware of? David, who had already heard some of this explanation that morning, asked the next logical question. So, this is punishment? You're destroying our financial stability to teach us a lesson about appreciation. No, I said firmly. This is education. For 15 years, you've lived in a world where financial problems solved themselves, where your lifestyles remained sustainable despite spending patterns that should have created serious difficulties. You never learned to live within your actual means because you never had to face the real consequences of your choices. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at James's perfectly manicured yard before turning back to face my children. I'm 74 years old. The trust fund that's been supporting your lifestyles was supposed to be my legacy to you, a way of ensuring that my children and grandchildren would never struggle financially. But I realized that I wasn't giving you security. I was giving you dependence. I was preventing you from developing the resilience, the resourcefulness, and the genuine appreciation that come from facing real challenges. Jennifer wiped her eyes and asked the question I knew was coming. So what happens now? Are we supposed to just figure out how to live on our actual incomes while you sit in your house watching us struggle? You're 43 years old, Jennifer. You have a successful career, a good marriage, and intelligent children. You're absolutely capable of adjusting your lifestyle to match your actual income and building a sustainable financial foundation for your family. But what about everything we're going to lose? Michelle asked. The house, the schools, the activities, the whole life we've built for our children? What you're going to lose, I said gently, are things you could never actually afford. What you might gain is the satisfaction of building a life that's genuinely your own, funded by your own efforts, sustainable through your own resources. The room fell silent as my children processed this perspective. They had come to this meeting expecting explanations, apologies, and possibly solutions. Instead, they were being asked to fundamentally reconsider their understanding of success, security, and family relationships. James finally broke the silence with the question that would determine the future of our family dynamic. Mom, is there any possibility of restoring the trust payments, even temporarily, while we figure out how to adjust our lifestyles? I looked at my eldest son, this intelligent, capable man who had built what appeared to be a successful career, asking for a return to financial dependence rather than accepting the challenge of genuine independence. The trust fund has been redirected, I said simply. It's no longer available for family support. Redirected where? David asked. I smiled for the first time that evening. To people who understand the value of help when it's offered. The question of where I had redirected the trust fund hung in the air of James's living room like a challenge. My 4 children stared at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to desperation, clearly hoping that wherever the money had gone, it might still be retrievable for their benefit. But what they were about to learn would force them to confront not just the loss of their financial support, but the stark contrast between their attitudes and those of the people who were now receiving their former inheritance. 3 weeks ago, I began settling back into the chair they had positioned for this confrontation. I contacted the Riverside Community Center where I've been volunteering for the past 2 years. They run programs for struggling families, single mothers trying to get back on their feet, elderly people living on fixed incomes, teenagers aging out of foster care, people who face real hardship but never stop being grateful for whatever help they receive. I paused, watching my children's faces as they began to understand that their lost support hadn't simply vanished, but had been transferred to others. I established the Walsh Family Hope Foundation with the redirected trust funds. $8.3 million that will now provide ongoing support for families who appreciate help instead of expecting it, who say thank you instead of asking, for more, who understand that assistance is a gift rather than an entitlement. Jennifer was the first to find her voice, her marketing background making her quick to grasp the implications of what I was describing. Mom, you gave away our inheritance to strangers, to people we've never met, who have no connection to our family? I gave away money that was creating dependency instead of strength, I corrected. Money that was enabling you to live beyond your means without developing real financial discipline or genuine appreciation. James leaned forward, his business mind clearly calculating the magnitude of what had been lost. Do you realize what you've done? That money could have secured our children's educations, helped us build real wealth, provided genuine financial security for the next generation. Your children were already going to excellent schools, I replied calmly. Schools that you can continue to afford if you make appropriate adjustments to your spending. Your families already have comfortable homes, reliable transportation, and every advantage most people can only dream of. What you didn't have was the character that comes from understanding how fortunate you are. David, who had already begun processing some of these concepts during our morning conversation, asked a different question. Mom, tell us about these families you're helping now. What makes them more deserving than your own children and grandchildren? The question revealed that even David, the most analytically minded of my children, still didn't fully understand the fundamental difference between deserving help and appreciating it. But it also gave me the opportunity to share stories that would illustrate why I had made this choice. Last month, I met Maria Santos at the community center, I began. She's 32 years old, works 2 jobs, housekeeping in the morning, restaurant work at night, and is raising 3 children alone after her husband was killed in a construction accident 2 years ago. Despite working 60 hours a week, she was facing eviction because her rent had increased and she couldn't keep up with the payments. I could see Michelle wiping away tears as I described Maria's situation, her maternal instincts responding to the image of another mother facing impossible circumstances. The foundation provided Maria with 6 months of rent assistance and enrolled her in a nursing program at the community college. She'll graduate next year and double her income, but more important than the money is how she responded to the help. She wrote me a 5-page letter explaining what the assistance meant to her family, how it gave her children stability during the most difficult period of their lives, how it allowed her to pursue education that would change their future. I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter, which I had brought knowing this conversation would happen eventually. She wrote, Mrs. Walsh, I know you don't know me, but your generosity has saved my family. Every day, my children and I pray for you and your family. We promise that when we're stable again, we'll find ways to help other families the way you helped us. Thank you for seeing our potential instead of just our problems. The room was quiet as I read Maria's words, and I could see the contrast between her gratitude and my own children's sense of entitlement sinking in. Then there's Marcus Thompson, 17 years old, aging out of foster care next month. He's been working part-time at a grocery store while maintaining a 3.8 GPA, but he had no money for college applications, much less tuition. The foundation is providing him with full college support, tuition, books, housing, and a monthly stipend for expenses. I pulled out another letter, this one written in careful teenage handwriting. Marcus wrote, Dear Mrs. Walsh, I don't have words to express what this scholarship means to me. I've been on my own since I was 14, and I never thought college was possible. Now I'm going to study engineering, and someday I want to create a scholarship program for other foster kids. You didn't just give me money, you gave me a future. I promise I'll make you proud. As I shared these stories, I watched my children's expressions change from defensive anger to something more complex. They were beginning to understand that the money they had lost wasn't just sitting in an account somewhere, but was actively transforming lives in ways their own comfortable existences had never required. There's also the Henderson family, I continued. Robert Henderson lost his job when the manufacturing plant closed, and at 55 he's been struggling to find work that pays enough to support his family. His wife Linda has been battling cancer, and their medical bills have overwhelmed their savings. The foundation is covering their mortgage for a year while Robert retrains for a new career, and Linda focuses on her recovery. I didn't have a letter from the Hendersons, but I had something else. A photo they had sent showing their family at Linda's last chemotherapy session. All of them wearing t-shirts that said, Walsh Foundation Warriors. Robert called me last week to report that he's completed his certification program and has 3 job interviews lined up. Linda's latest scans show she's cancer-free. But what struck me most about the conversation was that Robert spent 15 minutes asking about my health, my family, whether there was anything they could do to help me in return. The contrast was stark and painful. My own children, who had received far more support over many more years, had never once asked what they could do for me. The families receiving help through the foundation, despite their own struggles, consistently expressed concern for my well-being and looked for ways to give back. Michelle was crying openly now. "Mom, I understand that these families need help, and I'm glad you're able to provide it. But they're not your children. They're not your grandchildren. Doesn't family count for something?" "Family counts for everything," I replied, my voice gentle but firm. "That's exactly why I did this. I realized that by solving all your problems invisibly, I had failed to teach you the most important family values: gratitude, reciprocity, and genuine care for each other's well-being." Jennifer leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she probably used in marketing presentations. "But Mom, couldn't you have taught us those lessons without giving away millions of dollars? Couldn't we have learned to be more appreciative while still maintaining the family's financial security? For 15 years, you lived with complete financial security that you never acknowledged or appreciated," I answered. "What evidence do I have that simply telling you about it would have changed anything? You knew I had broken my wrist and needed help, but that wasn't enough to motivate you to prioritize my needs. Why would knowing about money you were already receiving have made you more grateful for support you had learned to take for granted?" The logic was unassailable, and I could see my children struggling to find counter-arguments that didn't sound selfish or entitled. David tried a different approach. "Mom, what about the foundation recipients? Don't you think it's unfair to them to base this gift on your disappointment with us? What happens if they disappoint you too? Will you redirect their support to someone else?" It was a thoughtful question. That showed David was beginning to think beyond his own losses to consider the broader implications of my actions. "The difference," I explained, "is that these families have already proven their character through how they handle adversity." Maria worked 2 jobs rather than giving up when her husband died. Marcus maintained excellent grades while living in foster care and working part-time. The Hendersons have supported each other through job loss and cancer without losing their concern for others' well-being. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out into the darkness before turning back to face my children. They've already demonstrated the qualities that 15 years of financial support never taught. Resilience, gratitude, and the ability to think about someone other than themselves even when facing serious challenges. James made one final attempt to find a solution that might restore their support. "Mom, what if we could prove that we've learned these lessons? What if we showed you the appreciation and consideration you've been looking for? Could there be any possibility of the foundation expanding to include family again?" I looked at my eldest son, recognizing the negotiation strategy behind his question, but also hearing a note of genuine desire to repair our relationship. "James, the foundation is designed to help people move from dependence to independence, not to create permanent dependency. Maria will stop receiving rent assistance when she becomes a nurse and can afford her own housing. Marcus will stop receiving support when he graduates and begins his career. The Hendersons will stop receiving mortgage help when Robert finds stable employment." I paused to let this sink in before continuing. "But your family's support was designed to be permanent, which meant you never had to develop the skills and character that come from taking real responsibility for your own financial decisions. The foundation recipients are grateful for temporary help that enables them to build sustainable lives. You had become dependent on permanent help that prevented you from ever testing your own capabilities." The conversation continued for another hour, with my children cycling through various stages of grief, anger, and bargaining as they came to terms with the reality that their financial support was gone permanently and had been redirected to people who would use it more wisely. But as the evening wound down, something interesting began to happen. Stripped of their financial safety net and forced to confront the prospect of living within their actual means, my children began talking to each other in ways I hadn't heard in years. They started sharing ideas about cutting expenses, supporting each other through the transition, and working together to maintain family stability during a difficult period. For the first time in decades, they were functioning as a real family, rather than four individuals who happen to share parents and holiday obligations. As I prepared to leave James's house that night, David walked with me to my car. "Mom," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I understand what you did and why you did it. I don't like it, and I'm scared about what comes next, but I understand it." He paused, looking up at the stars barely visible through Portland's light pollution. "I also want you to know that losing the money isn't the worst part of this situation. The worst part is realizing that I became someone who took your love for granted, who treated your support as an entitlement rather than a gift. That's the real failure here, and it's something I need to fix regardless of what happens with our finances." As I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I reflected on the evening's revelations and my children's reactions. The confrontation had been painful, but necessary, forcing them to confront not just the loss of their financial support, but the attitudes and assumptions that had made that loss inevitable. The Walsh Family Hope Foundation would continue its work helping families who understood the value of assistance and used it to build better futures rather than maintain comfortable dependence. And my own family would begin the difficult but essential work of learning to function as people who cared for each other because they chose to, not because they had to. The real test of whether I had made the right choice would come in the months ahead, as my children either rose to meet the challenge of genuine independence or continued to see themselves as victims of their mother's unreasonable expectations. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about our family's future. 6 months after that confrontational evening at James's house, I received an unexpected phone call that would prove whether my dramatic decision had truly transformed my family or simply damaged it beyond repair. "Mom," Michelle's voice came through the phone, steadier than I had heard it in years. "I have something to tell you, and I need you to sit down." My heart raced, fearing the worst. Had the financial pressure proven too much? Had marriages crumbled under the stress? Had my grandchildren suffered more than I had anticipated? "We did it," Michelle continued, and I could hear tears of joy rather than desperation in her voice. "All four of us. We've successfully transitioned to living within our actual means. And more importantly, we've learned something we never knew we were missing." Over the next 20 minutes, Michelle painted a picture of transformation that exceeded my most optimistic hopes. James had negotiated a work-from-home arrangement that eliminated his expensive commute and country club networking, allowing him to spend more time with his family while reducing their overhead by 30%. He had discovered that his children preferred hiking and board games to the costly activities that had previously filled their schedules. Jennifer had launched a freelance marketing consultancy from her redesigned loft, eliminating her expensive wardrobe and dining costs while increasing her income by 40%. More importantly, she had developed genuine relationships with her clients, finding fulfillment in work that mattered rather than just prestige that impressed. David had reinvented his fitness business as a community-focused program, trading his luxury overhead for a model that served working families at affordable rates. His relationship with Clarissa had resumed after she witnessed his genuine transformation from entitled entrepreneur to community-minded business owner. "But Mom," Michelle continued, "the most amazing thing happened last month. We were all talking about how much our relationships had improved since we started facing real challenges together, and Jennifer had an idea." She paused, and I could hear the emotion building in her voice. "We created our own family foundation. We each contribute 5% of our actual income every month to help families in our communities. We've already helped 6 families, and, Mom, the gratitude they show us, it's incredible. We finally understand what you were trying to teach us." The irony was profound and beautiful. My children, stripped of their unearned financial security, had discovered both their own capabilities and the joy of genuine generosity. They had learned to give rather than just receive. "There's something else," Michelle continued. "We've been working with the Riverside Community Center, and we met some of the families your foundation has helped. Maria Santos invited us to her nursing school graduation. Marcus Thompson sends us updates about his engineering program. The Hendersons had us over for dinner to celebrate Robert's new job. This revelation took my breath away. My children had not only accepted the redirection of their support, but had embraced the recipients as extended family members. Meeting them changed everything for us, Michelle explained. We realized that we had been competing with people who had faced real adversity with grace and determination. People who were genuinely grateful for help and used it to build better futures. We felt ashamed of how we had taken your support for granted, but also inspired by their examples. 2 weeks. Later, I received an invitation that brought tears to my eyes. My children had organized a joint celebration: Maria's nursing graduation, Marcus's acceptance to graduate school, and the Hendersons' debt-free status, combined with a family reconciliation dinner. The evening was held at David's Community Fitness Center, transformed with simple decorations and filled with an extraordinary mix of people. My children and their families mingled with foundation recipients, sharing stories, comparing challenges, and celebrating victories together. But the most powerful moment came when James stood up to address the gathered group. 6 months ago, my siblings and I learned that our comfortable lives had been built on our mother's invisible support. He began, his voice carrying a humility I had never heard before. Our first reaction was anger, confusion, and demands for restoration of that support. We felt entitled to money we had never earned and bitter about losing assistance we had never acknowledged. He looked directly at me before continuing. But watching Maria work 2 jobs while studying for her nursing degree, seeing Marcus maintain perfect grades while aging out of foster care, witnessing the Henderson family support each other through job loss and cancer, we realized that we had never truly been tested. We had never developed the resilience, gratitude, and character that come from facing real challenges. Jennifer stood up next, addressing the foundation recipients directly. You taught us that struggle creates strength, that gratitude creates joy, and that genuine accomplishment requires genuine effort. You showed us what it means to appreciate help rather than expect it. As the evening concluded, Marcus Thompson approached me with something he wanted to share. Mrs. Walsh, I want you to know that your children have become mentors to me and other foundation recipients. They're teaching us about business, career development, and family relationships. They've turned their own transformation into a way of helping others. The circle was complete. My children had evolved from entitled recipients of unearned support to generous contributors to others' success. They had learned the lessons I had hoped to teach, but more importantly, they had found fulfillment in applying those lessons to help others. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the painful but necessary journey our family had traveled. The trust fund cancellation had initially seemed destructive, stripping away financial security and forcing difficult adjustments. But it had ultimately been transformative, replacing dependency with capability, entitlement with gratitude, and shallow relationships with deep connections. My children had lost their financial safety net but found their authentic selves. They had faced adversity and discovered strength they never knew they possessed. Most importantly, they had learned to give rather than just receive, to appreciate rather than expect, and to support each other through challenges rather than expecting their problems to be solved by others. The Walsh Family Hope Foundation continued its work, now supported not just by the original trust funds, but by contributions from my children's own earnings. The families we helped had become part of our extended community, friends rather than recipients, partners in creating positive change rather than subjects of charitable giving. 6 months earlier, my children had called me a financial burden and calculated my worth in dollars and cents. Now they understood that the greatest inheritance I could give them wasn't money, but the character to earn their own success and the wisdom to help others do the same. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to stop solving their children's problems and start trusting them to solve their own. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is not security, but the opportunity to discover our own strength. In the end, canceling the trust fund didn't destroy my family's future. It saved it. And the children who once saw me as a burden now understood that I had always been their greatest asset, even when they were too comfortable to recognize it. The trust fund was gone, but our family was stronger than it had ever been. And that was worth more than any amount of money could ever provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.